The being in the loft. There was once a man who had a very intriguing circumstance to deal with. I will not name the man, for I'm sure he would not appreciate me naming him specifically, though I don't think he'd mind me sharing his story. In fact, he made it clear to me that if ever his story should be told, he would prefer that his name be omitted so as not to provoke any form of bias on part of the listener. For this man could be any man, any woman for that matter. Furthermore, the choice I have made to present this story as that of a man's curious predicament, which could just as easily have been that of a woman's unfavourable situation, could be, on my part, a double bluff to further ensure the anonymity of the protagonist. I'll leave that for you to decide. Now that that disclaimer has been stated for the record, we shall begin the story. The man whose tale I am about to tell was a man who loved to talk. Some said he loved the sound of his own voice. While this was true, that the man was in fact quite enamoured by his voice, he did not entertain this accusation from people, sensing that it was only said to hurt his feelings. The real reason he loved to talk so much was that this is when he felt most alive. Most of his endless chatter was in fact merely him thinking aloud the many thoughts circling the grey matter of his mind. Somehow, putting the words out into space seemed to effectively air out the inside of his head and make its contents clearer to him, giving him more room to reinstall and reorganize everything afterwards. It's what worked for him. Truth is, he didn't really give much thought to why he enjoyed talking so much. He just did. And if he were ever to give this subject any thought, I'm quite sure he would speak these thoughts out aloud as well. Either way, we now have firmly established that this man was not a quiet man who rarely spoke, nor was he a man who never spoke, or even a man who at times spoke quite a lot. He was none of these, being a very chatty man who loved to talk. One day, this man got tired of talking to other people. There were many reasons for this, but among them were that he had all but nearly given up on the human race. He generally enjoyed talking to others who also loved to talk, provided they gave him enough talk time in the exchange, and really liked talking to quiet people who didn't talk much, because they would usually let him go on for hours without any annoying interruptions. But in spite of this, the day came when he completely switched off from the idea of talking to other people. Maybe it was because he had been spending more time in his own company of recent and had discovered what a joy it was to talk to himself. The origins of this change in the man's behaviour are not known for sure. What is known is that the man decided from that day on he would only talk to himself. Oftentimes, others didn't seem to recognise just how interesting his utterances were, and this further discouraged him from making the effort to connect with others. Now there would be no limit, no restriction. No longer would he have to wait for the other person to finish speaking before he could speak. This man was not working and so could sit at home all day and night talking to himself until he got tired. He really enjoyed this new freedom at first. Then, after a while, he began to feel a bit lonely, as if it would be nice to speak to someone else sometimes. These attacks were easy enough to ward off, however. Simply by turning on the television and watching for a few minutes the foolishness of people prattling about like circus animals, he was able to reassure himself that he had made the right decision. Late one night, while the man was enjoying a particularly engaging conversation with himself, he heard a loud bang from above him. He gave it no thought and carried on with the controversial argument he was making. But then there was another loud bang. This is when the man became quiet and very still. The man was more than aware that he lived on the top floor of this block, and so there was no one living above him to make such noise. He spoke aloud his current mentation, saying, "Maybe it was a conker dropping off that large tree outside my window, or two birds entangled in mortal combat over my roof, or perhaps a wormhole has opened up right above this very block, and a small craft has crash-landed on the roof. Or maybe it's the sound of an engineer who has access to the roof and is doing some repair work. As he spoke, the banging continued. He was a very imaginative man and so could always come up with a host of possible reasons for any strange occurrences. It was often the most obvious explanation that was the true one, and so the man suspected that the council had finally sent someone to deal with the TV aerial, which was unreliable to say the least. "That's it," he exclaimed. He heard another 2 loud bangs in quick succession. If it was a repairman, he was being very noisy. Also, at 1:30 a.m. in the morning, not the time you'd expect to hear an engineer walking about on the roof. Because of this anomaly which continued to disturb him, the man put on his shoes and jacket and walked outside his flat into the communal corridor, looking for the entrance to the roof. This is when the man realized that no such door existed. If anyone was to get onto the roof, they'd need a very tall ladder, and looking up and around the building, the man saw no such appendage. Bewildered, the man returned to his flat, paying close attention to locking the door behind him. He had hoped that by going out to face the threat, whatever it was, he had put an end to this chapter. The man did not think he was a genius, but he did think he was wise enough to observe and know that simply by facing our fears, they tended to flitter away. This thought settled his nerves some, and he decided to make a cup of tea. Just as the kettle clicked as it finished boiling, he heard another loud crash from above. Annoyed now, and a little scared, he sensed there was a pattern to the noise. It seemed to follow some noise he made in the flat. He tested his theory out by staying silent for a few minutes while his tea brewed. The silence stayed intact. Then, as he squeezed the last drop of tea from the tea bag and began stirring almond milk and a spoon of brown sugar into the cup, the bell-like clank of the spoon was soon followed by the familiar bang from directly above him. The man paused in shock, sensing a presence that caused the little hairs on his arms to stand to attention. He spoke aloud his worry and fear, and once again the bang was there. The man realized that whatever thing this was, it was trying to communicate with him. It did not bang away in an arbitrary, random fashion, but only in response to some noise that he made. He wouldn't mind so if it were a gentle noise, but this dull, hard thud was not gentle in any way. It felt to him like someone or something trying to hit him physically through the floor above. He knew better, though, than to trust his feelings on the matter, knowing how easy it is to trick the 5 senses, and so dedicated himself to locating the logical reason for this noise. Looking up at the ceiling, he saw it. The square hatch above. The door to the loft. He didn't even know he had a loft until now. "Well, that's it," said the man, followed by a very loud bang. "There must be something in the loft. A squirrel, maybe." Another bang was heard. The man thought this to be unlikely, though, as it would have to be a very large squirrel to make such a racket. Nonetheless, he felt his fear growing and decided to act now before he was overwhelmed by it. He had not a ladder, but the living room table, at which he held many a grand conversation over dinner with himself, which would be high enough to permit him at least a peek into the loft. The man found the key to the loft among various sets of keys he had never bothered to concern himself with before. With a torch in hand, the man stood up on the table and slowly turned the long loft key in the shaft lock. He stopped just before opening it, thinking to himself in his head, not wanting to provoke another bang from above. "What if this thing is dangerous and tries to attack me as soon as I pop my head up there?" Quietly, he climbed down from the table and looked around for something he could use as a weapon. A kitchen knife would do. The man, as quiet now as he could be, got back up on the table and inserted the loft key again into the shaft, holding the knife in his other hand. He felt the weight of the door opening downward onto him, holding it with his knife-bearing hand and swapping the key for the torch in his other hand. Taking a deep breath, while trying not to be heard breathing, he shone the light of the torch into the loft, expecting the worst, holding the bladed edge of the knife outward in front of him. He felt the fear well up in him now. If only there was a light switch. The darkness was so thick, the torch barely cut through it, illuminating only one small area of the loft at a time. He had the terrible feeling that the being was skipping about, dodging the torchlight and hiding in the shadows. This thought disturbed him greatly as he scanned the loft as best he could with the torch, heart beating rapidly. He saw nothing. An empty loft. No obvious holes in the roof for anything to get in. No footprints or signs of life. Nothing. At one point, the man thought he could feel the being's breath on his neck, but put that down to a backdraft moving through the loft. His search was inconclusive. There was so much darkness compared to the light, and so he just could not see clearly enough to know either way. He would have to take another look in the daylight. As a last action before stepping down, he called out into the darkness. "Is there anyone, anything there?" There was no response. Realizing there wasn't much else he could do until morning, he retreated from the loft, locking it once again. Climbing down from the table, he wondered if he'd be able to sleep that night. The man sat silent on the couch for a while, thinking that he had probably done enough just by looking into the darkness of the loft to make whatever it was go away. Comforted by this thought, he tried to start up a conversation with himself to try and take his mind off this strange incident. He thought that if he talked quietly, perhaps there would be no banging noise in response. The weather, yes, that would do. It's been a really nice sunny summer. We're not used to such heat. I should have made the effort to get to the beach while it was still hot. It's going back to normal now. The man continued quietly until he was once again in full flight and enjoying the comforting feel and sound of his own voice. Eventually, after an hour and a half of this pointless chatter about the weather, he felt very tired and ready for bed. He crawled under his duvet and shut his eyes. Feeling quite relaxed now, the man let out a great yawn, while releasing an accumulation of gas that had been festering within him for some time. It was quite a sound, all coming out at once. It felt good to let it go. There was a loud bang from directly above him. "No!" the man cried, which was immediately followed by another banging noise, louder than the first. The reassuring feeling of safety he had cultivated for himself over the past couple of hours was now abruptly stripped away from him. He lay silently in the dark, feeling like something was watching him, or, as the case seemed more likely, listening to him. The man made not another sound. There was not another bang. The man didn't sleep that night. As the days went by, the man retreated more and more into himself, scared to make the slightest noise for fear of the being's response. After a week or so of this, he really felt he wasn't himself and became rather unhappy. Home was meant to be his safe space, the one place in the world where a man may be free to do as he pleases. Silence is golden. But if it could only be gained by the negation of his true chatty nature, then this was not the silence he desired. Following this inward insight, he resolved to resume talking aloud again, but would aim to do so quietly. Even this would not do, however, as he found that the being would bang away as soon as he started talking. One night, After maintaining an uncomfortable silence all day, the man whispered to himself that this really wasn't on. It wasn't right that he should have to suffer in this way. This whispered grief led into a longer monologue on his current woes. Before he knew it, he was in a full-flowing, albeit whispered, conversation with himself and quite enjoying it. Having missed out on this pleasure for the past 2 weeks, he achieved somewhat of a high from the experience. As long as he maintained his conversation at the level of a whisper, there seemed to be no response from the being. A few years passed, and the man was rarely disturbed by the being's ungodly banging noises. It was only when he forgot himself temporarily and spoke something out aloud, or when he made unavoidable noise, such as setting a bath or cleaning his teeth, that the being would once again make its presence known. I choose my words on purpose here to be clear, for there were times when the man could bathe in peace, with no fear of splashing, and no banging noise from the being. Yet at these times precisely, when he was leaving the bathroom, he would seem to see the shadow of something else leaving with him. He put it down to tiredness and stress, and tried to put such thoughts away from his mind. The man did not enjoy having to live his life as a whisper, but it was better than the alternative. He would not be silenced by this thing in the loft, for to a talkative man such as he, this would certainly bring about a debilitating depression. He didn't know what the intentions of the being were, though the nature of the noise seemed aggressive, and so he determined the being to be hostile. It would not make sense for him to talk endlessly into the night, as he was so fond of doing, as being in earshot of the being, he may inadvertently arm it with information that could be used against him. All in all, whispering was a good plan. This way, the man could continue to share the space with the being without being too disturbed by it too often, while maintaining his sanity. For every action, though, there is an equal or opposite reaction, and the man soon discovered that he could no longer raise his voice above the level of a whisper. He had become so accustomed to whispering that he had forgotten how to speak. Everything he said now was barely audible, an echo of speech. With great effort, he could push out a word or two, but set against his mouse-like monotonous whisper, this only made the man seem deranged. The man's true voice was locked up inside himself, and he now knew why the caged bird decided to sing. This unfortunate turn of events caused a lot of bother for the man. He felt increasingly irritated by people always asking him to speak louder. The way they would try to disguise their annoyance at having to strain themselves to hear him. The way he would try to hide his anxiety at not being understood. And the way he felt reduced to the role of a beggar, embarrassed for being in such a state and for being such an inconvenience to everyone. He resolved from now on to simply write down whatever he wanted to say to people on a paper pad he carried around with him. While this was generally an improvement, the man was astonished at how many people could not read. Then, of course, there were many who just marched off at the sight of his paper pad, believing it to be some form of a con or a ruse, and others who politely said, "No, I'm okay, thanks," as if he was trying to sell them something. The man wrote a letter to his GP to explain his recent difficulties. When he went in to speak with the doctor, though, it became clear that all his mentions of the being in the loft and its violent banging noises had led the doctor to misinterpret his experiences as the symptoms of a mental illness. He went to the doctor's surgery for help and left with a diagnosis of social anxiety disorder and a prescription for anti-anxiety medication. The GP described his condition as selective mutism and said that it may relate to post-traumatic stress from a violent event earlier in his life. The doctor stubbornly refused to accept the truth that there was a being in his loft, oppressing him and forcing him into this muted behavior. In fact, the man's repeated attempts to make the doctor see the truth only led to a further diagnosis of schizophrenia. He was then warned, in no uncertain terms, that if he persisted with this particular line of argument, he may have to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act and confined to a psychiatric hospital ward for further treatment. The man understood clearly what was being said to him. Doctors didn't like to hear of such matters as beings in the loft, and did their best to dissuade you from speaking of them. They were the unacknowledged shadow of the world, for to speak of, or even write of them, was to pay the high price of basic freedom. The man realized that because of this, he must now entertain two realities. The reality of the world and doctors, in which the being in the loft was not real, but only the symptom of a post-traumatic psychological disorder, and the reality in his home, where the being in the loft was very real in every sense of the word. He would have to find a way to coexist in both of these realities in order to survive. There were times when he thought the being was gone, but at this very thought there would be a loud bang above him, as if the being no longer needed to hear him and could read his mind. The man shuddered at the thought. What could be said of a being that you know nothing about? Where do you start? When a being is not even recognized by science, how do you research such things? As the volume of the man's life was reduced to near silence, he dedicated himself to trying to understand the matter more with the help of something on the local library computers called Google, which he'd recently discovered and taken a liking to. Hopefully, in time, and with the help of this Google, he would learn more about the being. As the man slept that night, the being in the loft watched over him. It didn't need to leave the loft, as it could see through solid structures like walls. For the being had the ability to see a solid thing in its actual form of vibrating ions and electrons. From the being's point of view, the man was just a composite of particles in rapid motion, against a backdrop of many such composite forms made up of such particles in constant movement. The being was thoroughly intrigued by the man. It had lived in many lofts, but had never come across a man like this before. Contrary to what the man believed, the being could hear him clearly when he whispered, every word, and even more clearly than when he spoke aloud. This was because the being could hear clearly all high-frequency sound, and had much difficulty in picking up lower bass-frequency sounds. Even though the man's whisper was lower in volume than his true speaking voice, the overall frequency of his whisper was at a higher pitch, and so within the hearing range of the being, and perfect for it to understand. The being even recorded the man's most intimate whisperings and shared them via telepathic projection with other beings in other people's lofts. The being did this not to disrespect the man's privacy. Where the being came from, there was no such concept, as all beings are part of a hive mind in which all thoughts are shared with all others for the benefit of the whole. Rather, the sharing of the man's heartfelt expressions with other beings was due to a genuine fascination it held for the man. Most humans spoke with other humans, but this human spoke only with himself. There was also the fact of just how interesting the being found many of the man's conversations. The being felt a kind of praise by association from the other beings when he shared the man's ramblings, in much the same way that humans feel when sharing good music with other humans. The being was invisible to the man, but the man was not invisible to the being. Though the man could not see the being, there are legends and mythologies of particular humans having the ability to see these beings, but most beings consider these just to be myths. Many people were able to see the shadow of a being, while not being able to see the actual being itself. The being meant the man no harm, and was upset to learn from his whisperings how scared the man was by all the banging. The being had actually made all the loud banging noises as a peaceful gesture to the man to make him feel at ease. This is why the being stopped the banging, not because the man no longer spoke aloud, but because it didn't want the man to get the wrong idea. Occasionally, the being would forget itself and make an odd bang here or there by mistake, at a particularly interesting point the man was making in his conversation. Beings in the loft were often misunderstood. Much of this because their own speech was not even audible to humans. The spoken language of these beings was extraordinarily loud by our own standards, but in the highest octaves of the higher frequency range. And so for the many years the being had lived in the man's loft, despite countless attempts to communicate with him. The man never heard so much as a whisper.